My name is Terra, and I am a knitter. And today I am going to be telling you my story of knitting. Knitting, at its core, is an act of radical love. Knitting is using very simple tools. It's taking 2 sticks called knitting needles and some yarn and using the same 2 stitches, a knit and a purl, and repeating them over and over and over again, using intentional holes to create a whole item. I came to knitting in 2010 at summer camp. During summer camp, every afternoon we were offered an activity, and it was either like a sport or a craft. And on that day, it happened to be 90 degrees. And you could go play dodgeball outside, or you could go to the craft space indoors with air conditioning. And I had 2 thoughts in my mind at the time. I thought, ooh, air conditioning. And I thought, ooh, wouldn't it be nice to make things out of yarn? And maybe this vision of how good I'm gonna be at that craft. So off I went, and I showed up to this knitting circle. And I was instructed to grab a yarn in whatever color I wanted, and I chose green, and some knitting needles. And I pulled up a chair and I joined the circle. And they told us we were going to be making a dishcloth. And first things first, let me dispel a few ideas you might have about me. I was not very good at knitting for 2 years. I was really, really bad. I didn't get good at knitting overnight. It didn't come to me in one stroke of anything. I was really bad. So during this knitting lesson, they said, we're gonna make a dishcloth. And I would watch the people around me do one little stitch and get it really good. And I would watch me struggle and struggle and struggle. And after that, I had a pile of holes more than anything. But I was not deterred because mostly I thought, this feels nice and I'll keep at it. So I kept at it and I kept knitting and I kept trying. And I kept bringing my knitting all kinds of places. Brought it with me everywhere. And when I got to the end of that ball of yarn, I realized it was a mess, and so I threw the whole thing away. A few months later, I picked up another project. I decided to pick up a scarf in the color purple, which it's part of this scarf now. And when I picked it up, I thought, you know what? I'm going to give this a try again. And I did. But this time I was better because my local library told me they had a knitting circle. So every Monday I would show up and I would join this knitting circle. And I was the youngest one by 20 years. And now you might ask me, what is a knitting circle and what is the difference between a regular circle? Which is a very valid question. Because I understand not everyone here is a knitter, but you can be. And so a knitting circle is where people gather together to craft things. And so one person in the knitting circle is so good at knitting, they can knit in their sleep. Then there's other people who maybe they might want to learn to knit, but it's probably not for them because they're not very crafty. That's not the thing that they could do. And then there's other people who have knitted at different points and maybe are stuck on a project and want help. And then there's someone who just wants to hold the yarn because maybe they're with a friend. All of these are valid and all are welcome. So I'd show up with my scarf that I was working on that was mediocrely better, but still not great. And these knitters who were pulling projects out of their bag that I could only dream of knitting would encourage me in my progress. They would say, wow, you've made a lot of progress in that. Wow, your lines are a lot straighter. Wow, there's not a lot of holes this time. And they were sincere in their feedback. And so I realized something as I kept going to this knitting circle. I felt so much shame surrounding my knitting because I wasn't immediately good at it. I wasn't good. And yet all the knitters that I knew were really nice and encouraging. So all this shame that I had surrounding my knitting was self-imposed. And so I thought, maybe I'm going to let that go. And I did. And when I did, I got better at knitting. But I also got better at knitting because I kept knitting. So once my rows got a little bit straighter, I just kept at it. It just kept going with me and I just kept at it. And so that scarf became something I could actually wear. And so I started taking it places and putting it in every single bag that I own, and it's gone everywhere. And every single time I pull it out of a bag, someone goes, ooh, that's really nice. Can I touch it? And I'm like, yeah, if your hands are clean. And then they go, I could never do that. And I say, oh, but just you wait. You can. Trust me, I was bad. And so my journey of knitting has been founded in community. So at that knitting circle in the library, I started knitting scarves, and then I ended up knitting hats. I learned a new skill from people who had been knitting for years. And I liked knitting hats, and so I kept knitting hats for everybody around me. And then I moved on to different places. I went off to college and did different things and went on to different places, and I kept bringing my knitting with me. And it seemed everyone around me was cold, so I kept knitting them things. And then once I would knit them something, someone would ask, hey, can you teach me to knit? And I would say, oh, yeah. So I'd bring out more yarn and more knitting needles, and I'd teach people to knit. I've knit at boring jobs. I've knit at boring meetings. I've knit in boring classes. I've knit in non-boring classes. I've knit at the doctor's office. I've knit on the T. I've knit on an airplane. I think I've knit on a ferry. I've knit in the dark backstage at a play. I can't think of the weirdest place I've knit, but it'll come to me. I have knit, I think, probably at somebody's wedding. I've knit during religious ceremonies. I have knit probably every place you can think about doing it. I knit when I watch TV. I knit anyways. To me, it feels like breathing. It's part of who I am. And I like it a lot. And so in this journey of knitting, I think there's something fundamental, maybe, that you should know. So in Howard Thurman's book, The Search for Common Ground, he writes this: all experience becomes raw material for harmony, for order, and the individual stands in ever an immediate candidacy for such fulfillment. When actualized his own potential, he becomes whole, harmonized, or fulfilled. And I don't know in the grand scheme of life what that means for all of you. I can only tell you what that means for me in my life. And for me, I find who I am in knitting. I have more yarn than I will ever knit in my life in my apartment, and I keep buying it. And every shade, every color, every thickness, every single animal they make yarn out of, I own in my apartment, ranging from rabbit to yak. I own it. I have a collection, and I love it. There is a yarn for every person, and there's a color for every person, and there's a knitting needle for every person. I firmly believe that. But here's the thing about knitting. You join it because maybe you're interested in making something you saw someone on TV wear. So you think, where can I order the supplies? Because to knit, you need 2 supplies. You need knitting needles and some yarn. And sure, you can order them off Amazon. They'll probably come in 2 days or a week or whatever the shipping is. But maybe you wonder, can I get it a little bit sooner? And so my suggestion is type into Google your nearest local yarn store. And when you go, you're going to walk in the door and see every color of yarn you could ever want. And you're going to see all these tools you never knew existed. And you're going to stand there and feel overwhelmed. And then a person or persons will say, can I help you? What are you looking to make? And in that overwhelmed, you'll think, I have no idea. I have no idea. I just wanted to come because I heard this wonderful speech. But that's okay, because that person is really nice. And they'll say, oh, okay. Do you have a favorite color? Oh, okay. Do you want to look at these books of things that you could make? And you think, I could make something? Yeah, you could make something. And then they'll lead you and they'll say, oh, do you want to hold it? Do you want to feel the yarn? And then they'll say, okay. And then maybe you'll look at yarn and you're like, oh, they don't have the color I want. And they'll say, don't worry, we can get it for you in 3 weeks. Oh, you're moving to Canada? No problem. We can ship it there. And then they'll say, oh, you want to learn today? If you wait 20 minutes, our knitting circle is going to start. Why don't you just stay? Why don't you just join us? Do you want a cup of tea? Do you want a snack? Do you just want to join us? We meet here every Wednesday. And so then you stay because you're like, you know what? I'm already here. I got the time. Why don't I just stay? And so then you stay, and then you've met all these people you've never met, and you're exchanging phone numbers, maybe email if they have it, because you might be the youngest one there by 30 years. You might. Or maybe not. Knitting's catching on with the younger ones. And so then the knitters who show up at the circle will do this thing where they bring their bags, and sometimes it's bigger than this, and they'll pull something out of their bag that looks a little like this. And you'll look at this and you'll say, a human made that? Like, what? Humans can make this? And they'll say, oh yeah, this is a cable knit. It's gonna be the back of a sweater. And you will feel overwhelmed, but they're like, don't worry, cables come after a few lessons. Anybody can do it. And they'll say, oh, you wanna cast on? Let me help you. And they will indeed help you. Because that is the thing about knitting. Knitting creates community. I have been part of so many knitting circles in my life. I have found them all over the place, mostly because I keep pulling knitting out of bags like, I guess, a wizard or something. I keep pulling them out. I keep getting invited to knitting circles ranging from the local library to a knitting store to somebody's house. And then as the years go by, I realize I've been going to the same knitting circle in this lady's house for 4 years. And when I started, I couldn't make socks. I didn't know how. I couldn't make socks. And then a lady next to me says she'd really like to make socks. And so she moves over on the couch next to me. She pulls out the item she needs to make socks, and I help her cast a pair on as I'm working on the cable pair in the photo. And I've made socks for probably 60 people at this point, and I teach her how to make socks. And she says, oh, I didn't know that I could do this. And I tell her, yeah, I didn't know that I could do this either. The quest for community is a lifetime thing that we are going to engage. I also know that we're gonna get cold. We're gonna get cold, winter's going to come, and even if you live somewhere where winter doesn't come, a breeze is gonna come. We're gonna be cold, and oftentimes we're gonna have to wait for something, somehow, some way, sometime. So I think, we got 2 problems. We could solve them with one thing. We could get crafty, we could knit something, and then your waiting is taken up with knitting, and then you're not gonna be cold in a little bit. The other thing about knitting, as I should tell you, is that nothing is accomplished in one day. Every single project takes a very long time. But to me, I find that encouraging. Knitting is not about how fast can I or you or we produce something. It's about the process of making something. It is the beauty in doing something and continuing the process. Knitting has been around for a very long time. One of my favorite things to do is to knit patterns that are hundreds of years old. I knit baby socks that were made in the middle of a war, and those socks are guaranteed to survive a war. And I hand them out to all the new expectant parents that I know. I say, these socks are guaranteed to survive a war. And they do. And those socks for that baby, the baby went on to knit hundreds of pairs of those socks. In the midst of crisis, she grew up and had a wonderful life, and then she kept knitting socks and giving them out. That's what I love about knitting, is it is so many stories. The communities that I have been a part of tell my story, and they tell stories of others. This knitting circle that meets in that living room has a book filled with the names of everyone we've given something knitted to, and it's over 200 names. We tell their stories every single week. And in fact, you can do really fancy things with knitting. You can make something fancy, you can make something plain. You can scarf every animal around you. You can scarf every person. You can do amazing things with knitting. It amazes me every single time that my hands remember the patterns. That I don't have to consciously think about what I'm making most of the time. My hands remember the patterns, even things that are very complicated. And I love when someone asks me, can you teach me to knit? Because the answer is always yes. Let me pull up my calendar and find a time. I love knitting because it's made me who I am. I have been doing this for 13 years, and I will do this until I can't knit anymore. I will knit forever and ever and ever, and it will always be part of who I am. And I hope in the hearing of the story that you have been encouraged to want to know what it is like to feel the yarn in your hands, to want to know what it's like to pick it up, to feel it in your hands, to want to cast on a project, to say, you know what? Terra was not very good at this. So maybe I too cannot be very good at this. So hopefully it won't take you 2 years. Hopefully you're very good at knitting will come a lot quicker than mine. But I promise you, there is a community out there in the knitting world that is ready and willing to find you. All you have to do is find your nearest knitter. And if you're here today, you can find me. Thank you.